I'd like to say good morning to everyone.
Good morning, good morning.
Truly, it's good to be back in the house of the Lord one more time. We're going to go our Sunday school lesson this Bible study week of July the 13th, 2025. The topic for today is a question of authority. Background passage is Matthew 12, 1 through 14. Printed passage is Matthew 12, 1 through 8. And the key verse is, I tell you something greater than the temple is here. And we're going to have a word of prayer before we start, and then we'll get into our lesson. First, to our Father, we just want to thank you for allowing us this opportunity to expound on your word, Lord. Just stop by for a little while. We know if you come by just for a little while, everything will be all right. And just let everybody that's listening in be able to get something, Jesus, out of this message that you're trying to tell us, Lord, that we all need to hear. And Jesus, just continually go with us and stand by us, Jesus. Lead, guide, and show us the way. And Jesus, see lesser of me and more of you. All these blessings we ask in your Son, Jesus' name. All these blessings we ask in your Son, Jesus' name. All these blessings we ask in your name. Amen. Now we want to, it's a question of authority. And as I said, the key verse is, I tell you something greater than the temple is here. We'll start off reading a little bit out of the intro. It's a tradition within the African American church has been a source of strength, but also of infighting, often leading to division and even false teaching. Nowhere in this tension more evident in the debates over music and worship formats spanning three distant eras. And in every era, the battle has often centered on personal preferences rather than the Word of God. In Matthew 12, 1 through 8, Jesus addresses the misplaced authority, calling us to align worship with God priority rather than human tradition. And you look down at it, it said, think about it. Jesus' teaching on the Sabbath challenges us to focus on compassion and God's priorities, rejecting rigid traditions that obscure his love and mercy. And in this lesson, we got three outlines. The first one is the Sabbath controversy, Matthew 12, 1 and 2. The second outline is Bible precedents for Jesus' defense, Matthew 12, 3 and 4. Mercy over rituals, Matthew 12, 6 and 8. And in this lesson, I want to start with coming out of Matthew 11. Starting at the 27th verse. I'm going to read that before we actually get into the lesson. Starting at 27. It said, all things are delivered unto me of my Father, and no man knoweth the Son but the Father. Neither knoweth any man the Father save the Son, and he to whomsoever the Son will reveal himself. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and ye shall find rest unto your soul. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. And this is going to tie in with our lesson that we have today, letting us know about the controversy that was going on between the Pharisees and Jesus. And it said that in the first outline is the Sabbath controversy. It said, at that time, Jesus went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were hungry and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat it. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day. And you notice it start off with "at that time," and that goes back to 27, chapter 11, 27 through, starting at the 27th verse. And his saying "at that time" is because the fact is that it was not that this happened immediately after that saying was said, but it could have been some time back. But they said "at that time" because it's gonna tie in with the lesson. And he said "at that time," when we went on the Sabbath day. The problem was when they went to the, were walking through the grain field, it's not that they started getting the corn. The controversy was not that they were stealing from their neighbors, because in that time it was legal for, if you're walking through someone's cornfield or something, because they had paths, and if you're walking through someone's cornfield, then their farmer was, by law, had to leave some around the edges that the visitors or the neighbors, they could come by, and if they walking through, they can get some and then and eat it. So it wasn't that they were stealing, so that wasn't the controversy, but the controversy started when, that the day it was the Sabbath day. And that's why the disciples started to, that's when the disciples started to eat it. That's when the Pharisees come up and said, "Behold, the disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day." But he said to his disciples, and they were hungry, and began to pluck the heads of grain and to eat. There was nothing wrong with what they did, because of the gleaning was not considered stealing. That's, we already went over that. And it said, because in Deuteronomy 23:25, the issue was only the day of which they did it. The rabbis made an elaborate list of do's and don'ts, items relevant to the Sabbath, and violated the several items on the list. Now, the law of Israel allowed people traveling through an area to glean enough grain for a small meal from fields in the area. Farmers was commanded to not completely harvest their crops, to leave a little behind for the sake of travelers and the poor. And Matthew just quoted Jesus offering us an easy yoke and a light burden. Now he shows us the kind of heavy burdens and hard yokes the religious leaders put on people. As far as some of this was not biblical, some of this was because of what the Pharisees wanted. They had so many do's and don'ts about the Sabbath. They had so many do's that you could do and what you couldn't do. And when the disciples began to pluck the heads of grain, in the eyes of the religious leaders, they were guilty of reaping, which was picking the grain, harvesting, threshing, that's rubbing it together in their hands, and whining is separating the grain from the chaff, and they was preparing food. So this represented four violations of the Pharisees' law that they couldn't do due to what day it was. And some of this, they had so many rules coming up that at this time, many rabbis feel Judaism was elaborate ritual related to the Sabbath and observance of other laws. Ancient rabbis taught that on the Sabbath, a man could not carry something in his right hand or in his left hand across his chest or his shoulders, but he could carry something with the back of his hand, with his foot, elbow, or in the ear, or on the hair, in the hem of his shirt, or his shoes or sandal. On the Sabbath, one was forbidden to tie a knot, except a woman could tie a knot in her girdle. So if a bucket of water had to be raised from a well, one could not tie a rope into the bucket, but a woman could tie her girdle to the bucket and then the rope. And so they had so many different rituals, that they had so many different rules about that. They even had to the point where you couldn't even leave your home without, they said 3,000 feet. If you walk 3,000 feet from your home and you went any step further than that, then it was considered working. So they had so many different opinions and rules about how or what you could do on the Sabbath and to consider that it was work. And so the Jews were superstitious concerning the observance of the Sabbath, that in their wars with the Romans, they thought it was a crime even to attempt to defend themselves on the Sabbath. When their enemies observed this, they deterred their operation that day, and it was through that Pompey was unable to take Jerusalem. That's what one of the scholars said, that was happening to read, because they were so afraid of not staying with what was law and what wasn't law. So if they was at home, they was afraid to leave home if they couldn't go too far, and whatever was determined to be work, it was confusing. So you really couldn't rest because of all of the aggravation. You had to think, whoa, what is this? I'm doing something, is I'm working? Because back in the time, if you were working on the Sabbath, then that was a law that you could be put to death. So being put to death, and then because it was so many of them, it was actually scared. It actually would tire you out just to try to remember what you can do and what you can't do. So Jesus is trying to get them to see that they got so many rules and so many regulations that you can't do and you can do, that it is confusing, and really they had so many rules that they were forgetting the actual meaning of the word of rest for that day, because there was so many things that they could do, so many things that they couldn't do, and just remembering what you could and what you couldn't do would tire you out on the day of your rest. So you just had to. Jesus was trying to get them to see that they got so many laws, and a lot of them was man add-ons. And when that's the problem that we get into today, as far as when we making rules, when we study the Bible, we trying to get the true meaning of what God is trying to say, then we go to adding our stipulations to it. We go to adding what we need on it to stop it. Just because I need something to stop me from doing this certain thing, that I shouldn't try to put it on everybody else because they might not need it. So they was really missing the point as far as to what God was, what it was when they said the seventh day was a day of rest. So it was for us to have a day of rest, to commune with God, and just thank God for what He allowed us to accomplish during that week. But with all the stipulations and all, it kind of throw things off, because the Sabbath was first established in Genesis 2:3 as a day of divine rest, was later codified into the 10 Commandments. It served as a sacred pause, a time for humanity to cease from labor and reflect on God's provision. However, by the time of Jesus, the Sabbath had become encumbered by an array of human interpretation and rules. These regulations, enforced by religious leaders, often lost sight of the Sabbath and true purpose to bless humanity with the rest and commune with God. And see, 1 and 2, Jesus and his disciples passed through a grain field on the Sabbath, and they were hungry. And so, yet the Pharisees, in their rigid interpretation of the Sabbath law, accused them of breaking the rules. The Pharisees focused on logistics. Tradition blinds them to the essence of the Sabbath. So they just had so many different things they was going through that was taking. First of all, they was actually trying to trap Jesus, is what they was doing. And he was letting them know that you got so many stipulations that you are forgetting the real meaning of what the Sabbath day meant. And we're going to go to our next outline, biblical precedent for Jesus' defense. But in 3, but he said unto them, have ye not read what David did when he was in hunger, and they that were with him, how he entered into the house of God and did eat the shewbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priest. Jesus was quoting them about David because David was being hunted after by Saul as far as to kill him, and because David was the chosen king, and Saul was trying to kill David, and David had been running, and he came to the temple, and he was hungry, and so when he got to the temple, he entered the house of God, and they ate the bread of the presence, and it was not lawful for him or his companion to eat, but only for the priest. So Jesus was reminding them that the reason the priest gave him the bread was because David was going to be the next king. David had been chosen to be the king. And he was hungry, he was in need, and the priest, by them being in the temple, workers in the temple, decided to go ahead and give him the showbread, providing that they had been, I think it comes out of 1 Samuel. It said, and David's, starting with 1. It said, then David came to Nod, to Amalek the priest, and Amalek was afraid at the meeting of David, and said unto him, why art thou alone, and no man with thee? And David said unto Amalek, the king has commanded me a business, and has said unto me, let no man know anything of the business whereabout I send thee, and what I have commanded thee. And I have appointed my servant to such in such a place. Now therefore, what is under thine hand, give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or what there is present. And the priest answered David and said, there is no common bread under my hand, but there is hollow bread, if this young man have kept themselves at least from women. And David answered the priest and said unto him, of a truth, woman have been kept from us about 3 days since I came out, and the vessel of the young men are holy, and the bread is in a manner common, yea, though it were sanctified in this day in the vessel. So the priest gave him the hollow bread, for there was no bread there but the shewbread that was taken before the Lord, to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. So that's the story of David. He gave David the bread because the temple, the priest in the temple took precedent over the Sabbath ritual that the Pharisees had applied. So and there was no recording in the Bible as was to where David was, because David wasn't a priest. He was going to be the next king, but he wasn't a priest. And so Jesus pointed out to them, asked them, have they read? And about that, he asked them that in our second outline, and he also asked them that again in our third outline. But the reason he was pointing that out is because it made sense to him that David's need took precedence over the Sabbath day thing, because it wasn't nowhere in Sabbath where he said that he wasn't supposed to eat because the Sabbath was a day of rest. And so when when they gave him bread, he ate it because he was hungry, he was in need. And that's what Jesus is trying to get us to see, that on the Sabbath is a precedent over some things that you do, some things that you can do some. If it's a need and you are fulfilling God's mission, then God is overlooking you because he didn't do anything to David for eating the bread that only the priest supposed to have been ate. And then, in our third outline, it said mercy over ritual. The third outline has said, or have ye not read in the law how that on the Sabbath day the priest in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? And what he is explaining to us right here is that sometimes certain things take precedence over other things. And because a lot of the regulations and all that was added to the Sabbath wasn't even biblical. It wasn't in the Bible. It was a day of rest. And he was letting them know that, he was asking them, had they read? And the Pharisees supposed to have been knowledgeable of the Bible and everything. It's just like us sometimes. And it's a difference in knowing about the Bible and actually knowing the Bible. We can talk about the Bible, but do we really know the Bible? I'm saying, do we really understand the meaning of certain things that God put in place? Do we really understand? Because there's some things that I might have one interpretation of, somebody else may have another interpretation of. But do we really understand the Bible? Even though we're reading the Bible, are we understanding what God is trying to tell us? So that's why they say study to show thyself approved. You have to study the Bible to get an understanding and ask God to lead, show me the way. Because some things we might take out of context. We might see it one way, and especially when we go to add self in. When we go to add self in, instead of asking God to show us what do we really mean? Because sometimes we can read something. It's just like if you can know a person. You can know all about a person. You can know what a person does. You can know but have you ever just sit down and converse with that person? Have you ever just sit down and actually got to know that person? Because what Jesus is saying here, or he said, back in the second outline, he said to them, have you not read what David did when he and his companion was hungry? And then he asked them again in the third one, or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath day the priest in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? Jesus was comparing, he was saying, you know the Bible, you've read the Bible, you've been through the Bible, but have you really understood who God is, what God really mean by telling us to take rest on the Sabbath? To me, as long as we're within the realms of God on what we do, and we are promoting God's message, and by helping someone, if someone is in need of help on the Sabbath day, then Jesus was trying to get them to see things take precedence over other things. And he said, and once we get down to the last outline, I'm going to go ahead and read the sixth verse. But I say unto you that in the place is one greater than the temple. Okay. Jesus is saying, but I say unto you that is the place is one greater than the temple. So he's letting them know now that they're really not questioning about the Sabbath. It's really going to come down to, as our outlines a question of authority. He's really asking, really it's coming down to Jesus is letting them know you're not questioning what was done on the Sabbath, you're questioning my authority as far as being who I am. So that way, and then it said mercy over ritual. It's the third outline. That's the outline. Then it said, but if ye had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice. You would not have condemned the guiltless, for the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath day. Jesus is letting them know that mercy is supposed to be is over the rituals that they put on. But like I said, some of the stuff that they put on was add-ons to really some of the things that the Pharisees wanted to see done, and it was so many. I think I was studying, and some of the scholars said it was about 39 pages of just different things. You couldn't, if you went to, you couldn't go 3,000 feet from your house. So if you walked past that, it was considered work. And if you went, they said now the only way you could do that is you had to tie a rope from your house to the next house, and then they could consider that part of your house. So it just got to be where it was just, it was just a lot of man-made add-ons to the rich, really, about the Sabbath. And
Pharisees wanted to see it instead of.
yeah, they want the Pharisees was at a point of
Control.
wanted control, and they didn't like Jesus really. And that was the point as far as taking up. There was a question of authority. So Jesus was letting them know that he said in verse 6, he said, but I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple. So the temple was a place where you could go and commune with God at. And so that's why they gave David that bread, because the temple took precedence over what the Pharisees done, over the ritual that the Pharisees had, because the temple was greater than that. And so Jesus is letting them know that he is greater than the temple. He is greater than the temple, because he said, you could go there to commune with God, but I'm right here, and you could commune with me, and I'm closer to God, and I'm than the temple. So he was letting them know that if you was reading the Bible and understanding the Bible, you wouldn't question my authority because of who I am. You would give me mercy instead of trying to sacrifice me, if you know who I was. He said, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. He said, so I'm the one that actually made the rule as far as telling you to have rest on the Sabbath. So I'm over that. So it shouldn't be any question of what my disciples, they're serving me, and it shouldn't be no question. But we got the Pharisees just wanted to be in charge. They wanted to know what they thought they know what was going on. But Jesus was giving them the full thing as far as to, he said, because the rest of the present, I deserve mercy, not sacrifice. Pharisees' lack of understanding in the principle was always a way that Jesus questioned confidence in the Pharisees had in their man-made tradition. They used those traditions to justify lifting principle like sacrifices above principle, like mercy, but when God had them do just the opposite. See, that's what it was. God wanted he was trying to tell them just the opposite. You show mercy. And we don't need to get tied down in, it's certain things that you're not going to do on your Sabbath day, when your day of rest. But now if somebody's needing help, we're going to tell them, well, you might wait till another day, because this is Sabbath, what are you supposed to do? And that one of the scholars made a thing about, he said, if your wife is in labor and the speed limit at 55 and you going 75, then what you gonna drop back down to the speed limit just because the fact is, that's what it is? Sometimes he says things takes precedent over others. If you're going 25 more than you supposed to, or you're going 20 more than you supposed to, then you trying to get her to the hospital. You're not just doing it just to be doing it. So what he was trying to say, his reasoning behind it all. So we need to kind of look at things before we jump to conclusion about seeing people doing things that about the Sabbath, and we know the Sabbath this day or Saturday or Sunday is God wanted us to understand that to serve him is to keep him first in your life. If you keep him first in your life, God, and that's what we're living under right now, grace and mercy. Because if we just was to think back, and you go to think about, now what would you have done back in that time on the Sabbath with all of those traditions and all of that they had going on by the houses of wood, and because you could be put to death for working on the Sabbath. And it would just be, it wouldn't be good. Okay, I'm gonna read the landscape. It said, in today's landscape, small churches often feel overshadowed by mega churches with massive buildings, cutting-edge technology, abundant resources. This comparison can shift ministry focus from Christ's mission to maintaining appearance. Yet in verse 6 and 7, Jesus reminds us that even the most reverent institution, whether the ancient temple or today's impressive mega churches gathering by the thousand in worship, must never overshadow the one they were created to glorify. He's letting us know, let's not forget him. Because if sometimes we get so bogged down in the rules and the rituals and all of that right there, we forget the real point. We forget the real point of Jesus. We forget who we're serving. Jesus boldly declared, something greater than the temple is here. For the Jews, the temple symbolized God's dwelling place. The Pharisees devoted to temple rituals failed to recognize that Jesus himself fulfilled the temple represented. He wasn't diminishing the temple importance, rather he was emphasizing that God's presence has come near, not through building or ceremonies, but through himself. Jesus then cites Hosea 6:6, stating, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. This rebuke reveals the Pharisees' error. They had built a system that prioritized ritual purity over human compassion. Yet Jesus consistently demonstrated that God's priorities are love, justice, and mercy. He healed on the Sabbath, forgave sinners, and dined with outcasts, showing the mercy always takes precedent over rigid traditions. The principle confirms God's warning to the church of Ephesus in Revelation 2, 4, and 5, where he calls them to return to their first love. Just as the Pharisees lost sight of the law's true purpose, many churches today risk losing focus on Christ's mission when they elevate structures over spiritual vitality. True faithfulness is not measured by grandeur or an institution, but by the love and the mercy that flows from Christ to other inside and outside the walls of a building. Imagine a group of ministers visiting a well-known church in bustling southern metropolis. The group asked their benefit guy, what ministries do you have to help the poor? The man responded that the church had no ministry to help the poor and homeless people who regularly circulated the church perimeter. As the minister departed, they wondered how a church with so many resources could be so negligent of the many needed people who regularly congregate there. For small churches, this message is liberating. Square footage and resource do not define faithfulness. Christ does, Christ does. Jesus' words remind us that the power of the church is not in its size, but in its ability to embody his mercy and truth. To remain vibrant, churches must engage younger generations while staying rooted in sound doctrine. This does not mean compromising faith, but rather refining methods to ensure growth and relevance. In every era, people have needed what only Jesus provided: healing, rest, hope, and transformation. The church's role is to keep Christ central, carrying his message forward with compassion, creativity, and a commitment to his authority above all else. And that's what this lesson is trying to teach us about. Keep Jesus first in your life. And focus on him, and he will lead you right. And that, like the title said, the Pharisee was more or less questioning his authority and not so much about as far as what they were doing on the Sabbath. And so we'll just end our lesson right there. And I'll read, remember what to remember. Remember, it is in Matthew 12, 1-8, present a multifaceted portrait of Jesus' authority. A Lord of the Sabbath, Jesus claimed the right to interpret and even transcend the Sabbath regulation. This authority stems from his identity as the Son of Man, the Messiah who inaugurates God's kingdom and fulfills the law's true intent. The passage revealed Jesus' humoristical approach to the law, prioritizing human needs and divine mercy over rigid ritual observance. His claim to be greater than the temple and the Lord of the Sabbath established his unique authority within Judaism and point toward his divine identity. For Matthew's community, the narrative provides guidance on the Sabbath observer and more broadly on how to interpret the law in the light of Jesus' teaching. So let's just remember that to follow Jesus, give mercy, and understand. Thank you.